Hello. Today's English lesson is about understanding the features of myths, Greek myths in particular, but a lot of these will be transferable for any myths, such as Norse, Viking myths, or Egyptian myths. So a lot of these are transferable, but we're going to be looking specifically at Greek myths today. So you have now hopefully read definitely Theseus and the Minotaur, and I hope you enjoyed yesterday's little virtual classroom library that we made for you, and hopefully you've read several myths on there as well. So now you're getting an understanding. And some of you, which was brilliant, actually wrote in the comments section some of the things you've noticed, which was really good. So well done for thinking about those. So I thought we'd start by actually working out what a myth is. And it is different to a legend slightly. They're quite often grouped together, but they are different. A myth is a story that's often used to explain why things are the way they are in the world. So they're used to fill in the gaps that science fills in afterwards. So when science was not very hadn't progressed very far, people would use myths to fill in the gaps in knowledge that they didn't have. So we understand the movement of the heavenly bodies, the movement of the stars and the planets and the sun, or the not movement of the sun, of course. But the ancient people didn't understand that, so they would use their myths to fill in those gaps, to try and work out what was happening. And some of these myths have survived for thousands of years. And remember, they had that oral tradition over generations. They were told by word of mouth for many, 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 many years, which was why that some of them you have different versions. A legend, however, has a little sort of grain of truth. Legends are things like King Arthur, Robin Hood, so they've got loosely based in truth. Again, they've been passed down the generations, quite often have important meanings or symbolism, and they quite often have a hero or heroine as well. So there are some similarities, but myths are more about filling in the gaps that science has left, and legends are sort of some basis in truth, but then this fantastical story has been created around it. So we're going to start by having a look at the settings that you may have in a myth. And again, we're going to be looking, we're going to be thinking about Greek myths here, but a lot of these are transferable to others. But let's have a look mainly at Greek mythical settings. They are set in the distant past. They would have been told originally around 1,500 to 3,000 years ago. So a long, long time ago, up to 3,000 years ago. But the actual time of the setting that the story is set in, it's sort of what we call non-specific. So there isn't a specific year that you can say this happened in. And that's because it's sort of beyond time. It's beyond when people thought about time. It was a time when even the ancient Greeks were thinking of it as ancient times, if that made sense. So they made up the stories about the gods when the gods were wandering the earth. And even in the time of the ancient Greeks, of course, they didn't do that, mainly because they don't exist. But that time was before even the ancient Greeks could sort of think about time. So it was this distant past, non-specific, before history, a time before history began. You quite often have, when I say backdrop, I mean sort of the whole general setting, this dramatic setting. So you would have things like mountains, maybe Mount Olympus where the gods lived, maybe an ancient city, a vast sea. There were a lot of seafaring myths because, of course, sea was one of the main way they travelled in those days to get from, especially from long distances. It would be via sea, especially as we know in Greece with all those islands, and there was a lot of sea around, a huge coastline. So definitely travelling by sea was a huge part of a lot of the myths. We also have maybe islands, Crete, for example, and also these mythical settings like heaven, the heavens or the underworld. And not the Christian heaven, so be careful that you don't think of it as the Christian heaven. This would be more the paradise where all the gods lived, maybe at the top of Mount Olympus, or the underworld, which was where the dead would go as Hades ruled over them. And sometimes you could get into that by crossing the river Styx, you'd have to put coins on your eyes, all those sorts of things. So you had these mythical settings as well as these huge dramatic settings actually on Earth. And yeah, there we go again, the mythical locations that I've already mentioned: heavens, the underworld, the home of the gods up on Mount Olympus. And quite often you swap between, so you may have some of it on sort of earth and some of it in one of these mythical settings like the underworld. You would also have this oral tradition, as I said earlier, of it being passed down from generation to generation. We're going to have a look at the plot now and some of the plots. Now, don't forget, this isn't for all myths. These are some general features that might be in a lot of the myths. So one myth might have one thing, another myth might have another thing. So the plot, and there's a very dramatic bitmoji of me there. The plot, quite often in a myth, it will explain how something began or how something happens, such as thunder or sunsets. So thunder might be when Zeus is angry and he throws his lightning, which creates the thunder. Or it could be that the god of the sun disappears at night and the goddess of the night appears as the moon. So it's explaining how something happens like that, or how the world was created, or how a certain animal was created, if you're sort of thinking. The myth of anyone that listened to the myth of the web, the weaver, that talks about the creation of the spider, Arachne, and that's obviously where arachnophobia came from. So that talks about the creation of the spider. The story sounds like it is something that could have happened. It didn't, but it's not read like a fairy story. It's not read as a once upon a time and they all lived happily ever after. So it sort of sounds like it could be real, even though it's not. So it's not a once upon a time and they all lived happily ever after thing. We don't start and end myths like that. They often involve gods, goddesses, heroes, very rarely heroines, unless they are a goddess. As I think it was Sam pointed out yesterday, you don't often get a female hero in not in the ancient Greek myths. Which is really interesting, isn't it? You would have goddesses, you had Athena, you had Artemis, you had Aphrodite, you had Hera. So you had lots of female goddesses, but not many female heroines. The hero was pretty much always a male. And you'd also have demigods, of course, which was when you had one parent that was a god and one parent that was a human. And they do often, as you probably worked out yesterday, often end in tragedy. So there might be something good happens, but then there will often end in tragedy, and quite often with a main character actually dying towards the end. Think about Theseus. You had that lovely part where the Minotaur was killed, all the Athenians were safe, but then you had poor old King Aegeus throwing himself into the water because he thought Theseus was dead, and of course you had Ariadne being left on the island by Theseus, who didn't really care much about her in some of the versions. So you do often have tragedy at the end of myth. They're not happy endings quite often. Sometimes, as I say, you have a main character dying. Sometimes they'll be punished. The gods, as we'll see in a bit later when we talk about the characters, the gods could be very angry, very jealous. They weren't like the Christian God of all loving and all caring and giving people and all knowledgeable. They weren't like that. They didn't they didn't necessarily give everybody what they wanted. They had the same emotions that humans have. And we'll talk more about that later. So often people will be punished as well. Also in the plot, you'd get fantastic beasts or mythical beasts and animals, minotaurs, unicorns, flying horses like Pegasus. You'd get all these sorts of creatures and beasts, and Medusas with the snakes for the Gorgons with the snakes for the hair, all sorts of things. So you could have these crazy beasts that I'm sure you would enjoy to make up. Also in the plot, quite often the hero would have to go on some kind of journey. Normally that would be long and dangerous, quite often would involve a boat, as we've already said, because of all the islands and all the sea. So there'd often be some sort of journey, quite often trials and quests. Think Heracles and his 10 tasks. Remember, it's Heracles when we talk about him in the Greek sense. Hercules is actually Roman. Disney got that wrong. So it's actually Heracles we talk about when we talk about the Greek version. So there were quite often quests or trials, and these were set by the gods. Sometimes, again, because of those emotions that the gods had, like humans' emotions, sometimes it was to challenge them, sometimes it was to prove something, sometimes it was out of anger, all sorts of reasons. Sometimes the gods would actually reward humans, and they would give them a gift, or they would fall in love with them, or they would punish them for not falling in love with them, or they would reward them by turning somebody else into something, or turning somebody else back from being something. So all sorts of things like that happened. The gods were really angry, jealous. They fell in love with each other. Humans got married but fell in love with other people. All sorts of things went on with those Greek gods. There would also be miraculous events happening, so events that were not realistic happening. So thunderbolts being thrown and things like that. It might be a volcano suddenly erupting. It might be the sea. Poseidon, the god of the sea, doing something with his trident and making the sea do something, and a sea serpent come up. So there were these huge and miraculous events that couldn't be real. Often magical objects as well. Sometimes given as gifts from the gods. They might reward a human or help out a human on their quest by giving them a magical object. Again, Theseus and the Minotaur, he had the axe, the two-headed axe. He also had the ball of wool that would help him out. With Perseus and the Medusa, you had the shield that he used as the mirror. So there were all sorts of objects, some magical, a lot of them were magical as well, that were given to aid the hero in their quest. The characters. Quite often we'd have gods, goddesses, as we've already said, heroes, not often heroines, heroes, lots of demigods as well. Lots of superhuman powers going on. And we're not talking about the Avengers here. We're not talking about Iron Man or Captain America or anything like that. But we're talking about having superhuman powers because they were related to gods, or they were gods or goddesses. The characters, particularly the heroes, would have strong characteristics like courage, wisdom. Gods as well, they would have courage, wisdom, but there would also be these negative characteristics to oppose that. So you'd have good, you'd also have evil from somebody else. You'd have strong, you'd also have weak. You'd have brave, you would have cowardly. You would have wisdom, you would have somebody not very intelligent doing something that they hadn't thought about. So you often had that sort of balance of characteristics. And of course you had mortals and immortals. Immortals being the gods and the demigods, and mortal being the humans. Immortal, don't forget, that generally means you can't die of old age. Immortals sometimes, not all the time, immortals can sometimes be killed, but they don't die of old age. It depends on the myth and it depends on the character. Right, some of the language features you get in myths. You get a lot of rich vocabulary, and we will look at this in a bit more detail when we are starting to think about writing our myths. But here we've got Heracles hurled the glittering spear with all the strength of a mighty army. Those rich vocabulary that really give us that dramatic element to the story when we talk about the description of the characters and the events and the setting. Similes are often used to help the reader to imagine. For example, Athena's helmet felt as heavy as a mountain. Vivid descriptions of the characters and settings. Fast moving narration of what happens. There isn't much speech in myths, which is something we've just written stories with lots of speech in. Your stories based on the game and your Jumanji stories, they had lots of speech in. Myths, we're going to strip that right back because they don't have very much dialogue at all. If you notice from yesterday, any dialogue was because of the style of that particular book. Whoever wrote that children's book wanted it in that style. But the original myths, when they were told word of mouth, would not have really had much speech in them. So any speech you heard would have been put in by the people that wrote that particular children's version as a modern version of it. Okay, we're not going to look at this for very long because, as I say, we're going to look at this this sort of thing more when you write myths. But this is some of the vocabulary you might see in myths. Some of this might be more to do with general myths rather than Greek myths, but some of it really does, just having a quick look now, really does look at the sort of language that you might want to use. So what I want you to do is just pause the video when I say and just read through this vocabulary. If you don't know what a word means, because there's probably a few there, maybe have a Google of them. Because I'm just looking through there, I think there'll be a few words. Nemesis, do you know what nemesis means? It's like your arch enemy. What else might you not know? Prophecy is like a prediction, somebody that is given a gift by the god and is able to see the future, and they are a prophet. Do you know what revelry means? Herald. Do you know what abominable means? So you might want to just have a quick Google of some of these. So pause the video now, read through and Google if you're not sure. Okay. Did you pause? Did you do that? Be honest. Yeah. Okay. I think most of you probably did. Okay. So hopefully you've had a look through of some of those pieces of vocabulary. Now, what I'd like you to do is have a look at this picture. There is a bigger version that you're going to look at in a minute. This is Poseidon, the god of the sea. He's Zeus's brother. And he is carrying here his trident, which is his three-pronged fork. That's his object that he always carries. There are a few things I want you to do. I want you to imagine that this is part of a myth of Poseidon. Now, I don't want it to be a real myth here. I want you to make up your own Poseidon myth, using him as the character, but something totally different. So don't do one that already exists. You're going to make your own one up. Okay. What you're doing in this top corner is thinking about 9 ambitious words to describe this picture. Think back to that page where we just paused. Any of those words you might want to use, or something else that's ambitious. Torrential might be a good one for the torrential. It's not really rain, is it? But the torrential waves. You could have. Let's have a look. Angry, or those clouds look angry, don't they? Angry clouds. That's like personification, isn't it? Now this is on a slide, and you are going to have to you might have to make your font quite small because the boxes aren't very big. So if you've got quite a long word, you're going to have to make your font quite small. So double click on the boxes to write in them. I also want you to give the picture a title. What would you call this picture? Write one line of correctly punctuated speech. Now we have said there isn't much speech in myths. There might be a little bit, but not much. So I want you to write one of those little bits there might be correctly punctuated. So 66, 99, what goes before the 99? You need some punctuation. If your reported clause, the said whoever, goes after the 99, don't forget you'll need maybe a comma unless it's a question. The full stop goes at the end, capital letters for names, all those things that we've been talking about. Down in the bottom here, would you like to interview an ancient Greek god or goddess? Circle yes or no, where you can use the circle tool to draw that, and give a reason that includes the word as being because in this one. So I would like to, as I would blah blah blah. Okay, or I wouldn't like to, as blah blah blah. So as means because in this sense. There are some quick questions here. Now what I've done, there's no room for you to answer them on this sheet. So on the Google slide, I've made another sheet. I think I've called it page 2, but it's actually page 3 because I then went back and added in the picture as page 1. But it's on the last page anyway. Sorry about that. So it says page 2, it's actually page 3. I've made the last page with 3 boxes with numbers 1, 2 and 3 in for you to answer these questions. And then I want you to write the opening to a story. That doesn't have to be 1 sentence. The opening to a story could be 5 sentences. Okay, so try and do a bit more than 1 sentence. I would say up to 5 sentences. Now, what I've also done on that last page where I've given you the space for these, I've also put an extra box for if you run out of room. So if particularly this blue opening lines box, if you run out of room there, go on to the last page, and I've put an extra box there for sort of extra space if you run out of room. Okay, so that opening line, don't think I'll just write 1 line and get away with it. I'd like you to write I'd say between 3 and 5 sentences. Okay. So that's the activity I want you to do. I hope that's given you a bit of an insight into the features you have on myths. And then tomorrow we've got a live lesson where we're actually going to focus on one of the mythical beasts, and we're going to be writing sentences about them using some fabulous vocabulary. So I'll see you tomorrow, but I look forward to reading these.